why don't we call this planet water rather than Earth? Then 70% or more of us, personally, as we walk around, is made up of water. And that is also true of the planet that we tread upon. So, and the water is everywhere, sometimes quite annoying, and in other times, we're sort of desperate to have it. And therein hangs a tale, and that part of that tale was what I told last time, which is about the assembly of the water management toolkit, or hydraulic toolkit, if you prefer. And the idea about that is that, and the idea about toolkits in general, who's here for the first time? Few of you. Okay, so let me explain what's toolkits, and then you'll have to sort of hum a few bars and take it as we go along. I think you'll get the drift. So this is an alternative way of doing world history, would be one way to put it. It's also an alternative way of doing the history of technology. And sort of in the middle of those things, the basic insight that I had is that stuff gets put together across all of Afro-Eurasia. You're not up on that one. I'll show you a picture of it in a minute. That's the great mega continent, the whole collection of peoples that go from Africa, the Atlantic Ocean, to the Pacific Ocean, China, right? That's all one space. It's interactional throughout all of history, which is kind of hard to believe. But if you talk world history as long as I have, eventually you come around to accepting that that is indeed what has been going on for quite a while. It doesn't go on as fast because we didn't have the internet back then. So it is, however, something that does go on. So just as one little, for instance, a little archaeological data point, I don't know what, first millennium BC Egyptian princess whose body was found in a formal burial in Lebanon, turned out to be wrapped in a silk shroud. Well, archaeologists, being what archaeologists are, they went to work and they went, where does this silk come from? Let's just think about this for a minute. And what did they discover? Whoops, this is silk that comes from China. Ooh, how does it get here? What did they have to trade to get it? How long did it take to ship, et cetera, right? So suddenly a whole series of world historical questions pop up. So the fun of doing world history is that you get to do all of those chasing things down that otherwise you're not, you know, if you're formally trained as an historian or you were trained as an historian back in the day, you were looking at dates primarily, and dates are actually important, but they're not important in quite the way that they were back in that day. And so it's the thinking about how stuff comes together in usable packages that then can get shipped around, right? So shipped around, I mean mentally shipped around. So somebody tells you, oh, you know what? I was just in India and you know, they're working with the decimal point down there. How come we didn't get that when we got our Arabic numbers, right? Why don't we have a decimal point too, right? Since the Indians invented this. And while we're at it, let's have a zero as well, right? Which the Indians also worked with. So this is just one of the examples I used last time as a way of showing stuff goes around. And that particular little item is something that Ibn Sina, Avicenna to some people, is instructed to learn by his dad after he has dazzled the world with his 12th grade erudition on all that was known. And he goes, he's sent down to the greengrocer to find out about Indian numbers, because that's where they know how to do that stuff. And Dad, of course, doesn't know how to do it because he's above it, right? He's still with the Roman numbers, right? God bless him on multiplication, etc. He never ever tried that, right? Okay, so onward with the show. So this is the topics I'm going to be looking at. So the water, not earth, is an alternate way into the maritime toolkit. I just thought I'd throw it in. It's something I've been following a bit, and it's not well developed, but it's just to give you a hint of that. Another way in actually can help expand our consciousness in ways that are quite interesting. So then I'm going to talk about the the maritime toolkit. What did it take to sail the 7 seas, or even the 1 sea, or even just the Nile River? So different strokes for different folks. So it meant, in some cases, it meant a triangular sail that is movable, or a triangular sail that's not quite so movable. Or it might mean a square sail, or it might be get out the damn oars and start rowing. There's a lot of different approaches to how you could move on water. And moving on water turns out to be job one, or at least job two. Job one being let's put water on the plants, and let's move that water around to where it could be useful. And job two is definitely let's move ourselves around. And how did we do that anyway? Herein hangs a tale. So if we just look at this map, so the one that is in dark exposure, if you're coming along just recently and haven't seen this before, is Afro-Eurasia. Sometimes I'm going to be talking about Eurasia, which we could just call the continent of Asia, because of course, as I said last time, Europe is just one more peninsula off of the Asian landmass. And that's hard for Europeans to get together with, but you know, sooner or later that message is going to come home, and we just know it is. All right, so water, not earth. This gives you a good idea of where the water is, which is just about everywhere, including the intricate little waterways and seas and so on that are part of West Asia, right? So one of the things that distinguishes West Asia is that the water comes quite a ways in, right? So it basically surrounds the peninsula that is called Europe. And and Europe on this map, because this is a sort of Mercator-ish kind of a projection, which is the only way you can sort of render it in the Earth in flat sort of perspective. So Southeast Asia and India, which are in square mile areas more or less the same size as Europe, with more or less the same number of major river systems and more or less the same number of major languages and religions and so on. All of that just fades to black, and all we see is Europe is like this huge big space, and everything else is little. But of course, Greenland is giant too, and we all know that's not right. And then poor old Australia doesn't even get to be a continent, sab. Okay, so onward. So let's just take this theme. I'm not going to dwell on this very long, partly because I don't know enough to dwell. But it's the idea of just, what if we start with a water perspective? What does that do to our heads? How does that change the way in which we think? And one of the things is that for humans to come out of Africa in their various migrations. So now the migration story is that they didn't all come at once. They came over a much longer period, millions of years, perhaps, but it's certainly a million of years. So there are proto-humans, humans who diffuse around, who can come out of Africa, but which now seem to have quite distinct and different histories. So there's the Denisovids, and there's the Chinese. It's not civilizational exactly, but there are distinct DNA types of early humans, right? So it's not Cro-Magnon man and Neanderthals anymore, and then suddenly we get the wonderful Homo that is us, right? But it's a much broader palette, and it includes a lot of migrations that we didn't really understand how they operated. So in the Upper Paleolithic, which is basically prior to 1200 before the present, that's the BP. I'm going to go back and forth because I'm in the process of trying to retrain myself too. When I started doing world history, we were still doing AD and BC, right? And then that people just said, no, you can't do that. And then because not everybody is on that calendar necessarily, or doesn't find that calendar very convincing. And then we went to before the present and after the present. So that's BP. And it's not British Petroleum, sorry. And now we're in something, sometimes it's called before the present age, even BPA. So anyway, stay tuned. It will change.
When did the present start?
And when does the present start? There's another whole little debate too, right?
Yes.
Right. So it gets very tricky. The more nitty gritty you get about it, the harder it is to sort out. All right. So Upper Paleolithic is as my friend David Christian told me, the man who invented something called big history, which has become something of a sensation. And big history is everything all the way back to the beginning of the universe. So now we're in deep time, and we're in deep trouble, right? But certainly deep time. And the Upper Paleolithic is as we're coming forward. So the Holocene is the era that we we humans have been in, more or less since agriculture starts to happen. but agriculture actually happens a bit later than that in any systematic way. It's really not until about 3000 BC, or if we're going to put it into BP, it will be 5000 BP. See, it does mess with your head. And I don't do that as a natural act at all. But anyway, in this very vast time period, there are a lot of things go down that are very important. And one of them is people start moving around. They start getting together with one another. They start moving around, and they go also even in the billion years or so in which the Upper Paleolithic is encapsulated. Continents are moving around too. So it used to be Australia, Antarctica, and India were all part of the same thing, along with New Guinea and bits and pieces of insular Southeast Asia. And so continental drift has been happening, which is one of the things that helps to explain why the same kinds of animals and birds are found in South America that are found in Australia. Right. So it's very interesting. Just this deep time perspective is a very useful one. All right, so Upper Paleolithic then is a period in which people are moving around. I'm going to move then rather quickly through Oceania and Southeast Asia and the movements that go there, and then pre-Chinese navigation, just to give us a whole picture. So first of all, an Australasian perspective. So if we look at China is on the edge here of this continental space, which includes New Guinea in this particular rendition, as well as Australia, which, since they were part of the same plate, that's only fair. A little bit of New Zealand down in the lower right-hand corner. Antarctica, which used to be part of that also. So there's a huge, vast ocean here, the biggest one, indeed, that we have, which is the Pacific. But it's not an enclosed space like the Indian Ocean world, with Africa punctuating it, and then we go around, and then we're in the Atlantic. But it's a much vaster space with all these intricate little islands dangling off the edge. And you can come at those islands as people normally do when they're sort of trying to teach this kind of a thing via the Indian Ocean world. And you will get one way of thinking about it. What I want to say is that actually there's a lot of navigation that is going on in this period that we need to also be aware of, and that helps to shape a sense of what a toolkit might be. Okay, so the peopling of Australia is now, it used to be 60,000 years BCE. Let's just flip back to that one. And it was, and that number indicates there's a debate, right? So is it 44,000 years BCE, or is it 70, right? 70 is a big number, right? 70 is before the peopling of the Americas, by quite a bit, right? That may be 10,000 or so, but any sensible way, once sort of people start tracking the DNA and so on, that one goes usually back to about 3,000 or so. Those goalposts are in play as well. All right, so the peopling of Australia takes place by water, right? And it takes place by water in a number of different ways. So people are coming from insular Southeast Asia, different pieces of it that are closer, and people have learned already, humans have learned already how to navigate in some primitive ways, if only paddling, sitting on a log. You could start doing that, and then you could say, well, this is screwy. Why don't we have a boat, and then let's hollow out this log and see where we can get to that way. Or let's figure out still some other way of doing it eventually, and maybe start building ships of one kind and another. All right, so all of this is going on, and Australia gets people coming out, drifting across. So there's some Chinese DNA in Australian Aborigines, and then there's sort of what becomes the Nesians, Micronesia, Polynesia, etc. And it all comes together there. All right. So here, however, what I wanted to talk about is Polynesia and the Polynesian voyages, but those are preceded by other voyages from the nearer to the coast, Micronesia and the Philippines and so on. All right. So there are canoes, and even canoes with sails, that are experimented with even back in the somewhere in the Holocene. We don't have that date very firmly in mind yet, and the archaeology on this, as you can imagine, is very hard to do, since wood decomposes in water. Unless you're really lucky, you're not going to find any leftover things that you can date. However, and those of you that have been in Hawaii or been to the Bishop Museum or looked at comparable programs on TV or online will have a good sense that the Polynesians were extraordinary navigators, truly extraordinary navigators. They used two hull canoes, so you see two little prows there, two sails. That's the same vessel, right? And they were able, without having anything in the way of a compass or any navigational instruments whatsoever, they were able to navigate themselves fairly precisely across vast distances, tens of thousands of miles of ocean, right? I mean, it's just truly extraordinary. And they did it through close observations of the sun, of stars, of birds, which birds are where, what kind of birds live on which islands. So if we see this kind of bird, then we know we're getting close to this island group. Bioluminescence, so what glows in the water at night? And those are distinctive signatures too, if you're clued in on it. And then not so much the moon. See, the moon hits your eye like a big piece of pie, right? It's not really going to get you places because it moves around and there are clouds, and stars are a much more reliable thing. And they had absolutely, well, they had, no pollution, but they could actually see the stars, right? There's no problem. And they could navigate from one star group or one polar star to another, right? So if you move along a ways, then that one drifts out of relevance to what you're doing, and then you pick up on a new one, right? And this stuff is all explained in wonderful ways so that we can understand it these days. So here's another slide of these canoes, and it is in this fashion that we get the Polynesian triangle built, or the Polynesian cone, as it's sometimes called. So that's the light purpley thing going off to the right there. All right, so you can see Easter Island is at the point of that, way the heck in the South Pacific, and it goes all the way up to Hawaii. So late in the game, so those islands, Hawaii and the nearer islands are populated in and around well, sort of 200 BC to about 1000 or so, and Hawaii comes toward the end, and then the people who will become known as the Maori, right, the inhabitants of New Zealand, are not indigenous to New Zealand, but actually they come from Hawaii. They paddled all that distance. So you want to talk maritime toolkit? Here's your maritime toolkit. It has nothing in it. It's all in your head, right? So the ability to navigate is something that young people are taught from early on, and you pay attention to your elders in this period, and so they do. Okay, so the Oceania then is populated by people who are navigators, as is Australia in some other way. The same people that populate Melanesia and Micronesia also, get this one, by around 200 or so CE, populate Madagascar. Right, so hang on, do I have that map? That map will come. All right, so keep that little thought in your head, and we'll see what that might have been. So that means sailing through Southeast Asia, which is already present, right, all the way to Madagascar in these canoes, right? Okay, so early Chinese mariners, we are beginning to learn more and more about. The Chinese had been putting a certain amount of money into archaeological studies, and as a result of that, we now know quite a bit more than we used to. So there is established trade from probably at least 200 or so. These are numbers that are very spongy. Again, there's no archaeological evidence, and how would you even begin to track it down? But this is now what we are beginning to think, historians are beginning to think, particularly nudged a bit by their archaeologist brothers and sisters. So there's trade with the Pacific. There's trade with Southeast Asia. There's trade with the Ryukyu Islands, which includes Taiwan as its largest. So there's these different island chains. And Chinese are already there in the period before 900, which is more or less the date for the Song period, right? So when this very important dynasty begins to emerge in China. And they develop a whole series of maritime skills and navigational tools, including a different approach to what is a boat and how do you make it, which we'll get into a little bit further along. But China just as a one of the distinctive features of a Chinese vessel is that the sails have got these battens in them. They're very pronounced sort of things. Battens being pieces of wood that hold the sail steady, so that it will hold the wind better. But the compass is invented at some point in China. Whether it's in this early period, that seems unlikely, but certainly in the more, as we move closer to the present, the compass is invented and a whole new approach to the construction of naval craft, which brings us to, in some ways, where this is one of the places where you could sort of say, okay, game over, toolkit assembled, we can all go home now. And it's this remarkable mariner who's had 7 different voyages over a very long period, 1405 to 1433, whose name was Zheng He. Used to be known as Cheng Ho before they changed the spelling and the pronunciation, but Zheng He is the official way we talk about this guy. You may have seen about him online in various places. There are film strips and so on him. Different programs have looked at him. He has left an historic legacy all around Southeast Asia, as far away as Africa. All right, so he got between 1405 and 1433. We're now in the era of the Ming dynasty, and the early Ming is a period of relative internal peace, and most importantly, they are not threatened by steppe peoples from the north. That changes the whole weather pattern once that starts to happen, right? So starting in 1405, he goes off on these amazing voyages with fleets that number in the hundreds of vessels. Some have said as large as 400 feet long and very tall, right? Very distinctively tall, such that they can accommodate thousands of people, including soldiers and horses, and water for all, right? Water for all because it's a serious problem for the Portuguese and the people that are with Columbus, right? Drinkable water becomes a very big deal. The Chinese solved that problem by the time of Qing He. All right, so the historical context then is one in which there is this pre-existing period of trade with Southeast Asia that I talked about just a little bit ago, which then gets so it goes on, sort of advanced speed and increased size as particular products that the Chinese produce become something that is very much desired in the lands of Islam and also across Southeast Asia and in India. Question.
Was he responsible for originating some of the early maps used by Europeans?
Yeah.
The early?
Did he make some of the maps that were used by early Europeans?
No, as far as we know, I don't think we have any maps that come from that period. There are some maps that purport to come from that era, but it seems unlikely that that's it. But there, anyway, it is quite extraordinary, and there's lots that has been found, and there's a whole discussion, indeed, as you might imagine, about 400 feet long. Let's get real, right? How could this be, right? And why don't they tip over? So we have a ballast problem, we could say. That's why a ship doesn't tip over, because it's got heavy keel, got stuff down below decks. Most of your boat is below water. So it needs to be balanced so that it will not flip. And then these ones had 6 and 7 stories, and they were quite huge, right? And I'll show you a picture in a minute. So what is this giraffe doing in our story? And so the giraffe, so Zheng He is sent by an early Ming emperor to go to Southeast Asia and the Indian Ocean world and to bring the good news of the Emperor of China is their friend, and to bestow gifts upon them, and to invite them to send return missions to him, which will be accompanied by similar gifts. And we'll get a gift exchange thing going, and that will be dandy. We'll all like that. And on the back of all that, some trade can happen, right? So porcelains and Chinese silks are two items that are particularly current right then in that point in China, and which we haven't quite got to. I have a textile toolkit, and which we might get to maybe next year. I don't think that's coming up in our next meeting on Thursday next week. But anyway, so the size of the ships, the size of the fleet, right? The distances traveled. I think we've got this map here. There it is. All right. So just check this out, right? So he goes all the way to East Africa, and there is what some archaeologists regard as convincing evidence that actually the Chinese stuff from a Ming period ends up there. Well, is it secondhand Chinese Ming stuff that ended up there because somebody else brought it? That's another whole problem. But you know, Mogadishu, Malindi, cities along the east, the eastern coast of Africa are very much drawn into trade. This is very much part also of a trading network. Do I have that map loaded? I wonder. Of the Muslim trade networks, which went all the way down to East Africa also, right? So that the Indian Ocean world is a vast world which includes East Africa, I guess is one of the takeaways from this. And Cheng He is not the first person to be there. He is repeating an already established trading pattern, right? But he is also, I have to say a little bit about who he was. So he is a Chinese Muslim, and he is his father does something slightly disrespectful as seen by the early Ming, and so his son is basically taken, turned into a eunuch. The word for that is called castrate, and then the world is his oyster, literally, right? He gets to go everywhere. He becomes a very important figure in the court. He becomes a high general and admiral of the seas, because this is a period in Chinese history in which Muslim courtiers were at the top in the struggles between who gets to advise the emperor. So the Mandarin Chinese temporarily, who are still on the scene, are now on their back foot and not being able quite to get the ear of the emperor in the way in which they used to be able to do so. And so the Chinese Muslim eunuchs have their day, and no one seems to have had a bigger day than Cheng He. Right, so he is then a favored person at court. He has been selected for this role by the Chinese emperor on advice from other people in the court, no doubt, including the cabal of the Muslim eunuchs. Yes, question.
When did this story get into the history books? Because I never heard it before.
Well, it does get into the history books these days. The problem is that most of us read history books that when had China in the book would be already something. And you know, world history is something that is a kind of a how would we describe it? It's sort of a well, it's Eurocentric, of course, but I mean, everybody's got to come from somewhere, right?
And how had the Muslims made their way all the way across to China by this time?
Oh, of course, absolutely. No, among them famously a Chinese, a Moroccan voyager named Ibn Battuta, right? Who some of you may have heard from. Equally as big as Cheng He, actually, in some of these spaces, right? I have a friend who wrote a biography of Ibn Battuta, and he gets invited to India, the Middle East, all over the place, because Ibn Battuta is a really big guy. He probably went to most of the places he claims to have gone to, which is not always the case with Marco Polo, who is sort of his rival, who may have made some stuff up, you never know. But who certainly did get to China, right? I mean, there's no doubt about that. All right, so So anyway, so this is the game board that the Chinese emperor is playing on. Zheng He also wants to go on the Muslim pilgrimage, which he may or may not have done. There's again, that gets a little, that's a sort of a head scratcher, right? People that looked into that and tried to write about it. It's not entirely clear whether he did or not. It would be a logical thing for him to do, although it might also be not a logical thing for him to do in the sense that it would call attention to his Muslim identity at a time when these things are beginning to bubble around in the court, and might not be such a great idea if he is seen to be somebody who is a practicing Muslim. So being a Muslim, an ex-Muslim, a Muslim who has been put into court service is one thing, and being a practicing Muslim might be another. All right, anyway. Ta-da. So the Zheng He toolkit, just to look at it that way, includes a compass, it includes an onboard rudder, an inboard rudder, I'm sorry, that's the correct actual formulation. So you don't dangle off the back trying to steer, right? It gets to be something where these vessels are as big as they are. Some little guy with a paddle in the back of the boat is not going to get the job done, right? So if you're trying to steer such a vast vessel, you definitely have to do that. It's a combination of square and triangular sails. So because we are backing into our story, I haven't told you the story of the square sails versus the triangular ones yet. But let's just leave that dangling for a moment. It had amazingly waterproof compartments, right? So if if they run on a rock or something, the ship is not going to sink, right? They have it all sorted out in advance, and it is put together with iron nails, right? So that again is a distinct feature. So all right, so the Zheng He toolkit is quite formidable, and it includes a number of solutions to problems or that become part of his, what we could call, nobody else does this, the Zheng He toolkit, but it becomes part of the common toolkit that Europeans help to devise, but also are borrowing from when they set off for the Canary Islands and points further west and south, right? Anyway, so Zheng He was, in addition to being a famous mariner and having gone on all these different trips and having marked a point in the history of the foreign relations of the Ming Dynasty, by the time he dies, things have changed. Storm clouds are in the horizon, and whoops, there are Mongols coming, right? So that's a different story. So the court eunuchs are now out of favor. And the mandarins take over, the Chinese mandarins take over in the court, and they say, let's just stop these voyages right now. I mean, now, hello, now. These are sucking up huge amounts of resources. We got major things we got to deal with here that are happening, and that's just enough. All right, so that was enough. So they are not followed up. Could Zheng He have gone around Africa backwards, so to speak, the other way? Let's leave that question dangling, and somebody can ask me that. Okay, so these are recreation to artistic representations of the Zheng He fleet. So the lower right-hand one is a postage stamp, right? Zheng He becomes sufficiently powerful that he commands postage stamps. And the other one is a scale model, or not a scale model, because it actually those boats would have been much, much bigger. This is probably some rich guy's toy, which has 6 or 8 decks, and you can look at it. It's the one with the yellow sails there on the left, and there would have been 20 or more of such vessels surrounded by smaller ones in the fleet that went around. So needless to say, when Zheng He shows up in your harbor, you go, oh, what's going on here? However, it's not so bad. All right, so now we are transitioning into the Indian Ocean. Oh, here's the Chinese junk, actually. Sorry about that. So this is what the battens and the sails looks like, if you were curious about that. All right, so now we're transitioning. So here we are back to Afro-Eurasia. So this is sort of home base. And we're going to go through, and we're going to be looking now at the regional toolkits. I did some of this already. So we've done the Australasian bit, the Western Seas bit also. Western Seas, that is to say, Western Seas of who? These are the Eastern Seas, I suppose I should say. No, the Western Seas Western seas,
From our continent.
I was going fast when I wrote that. All right. So the Indian Ocean world before 1500, we want to be. But first, we got to go back and start all over again because there are different toolkits for the different spaces. So the spaces that we're going to be talking about, I'm going to talk about just briefly. And we got about, I don't know, 10 or 12 minutes to go before I'm going to have a break. It has to do with, first of all, they have distinctive seasonal wind regimes, right? So it could be monsoons. If we're in the Indian Ocean world, East Africa, et cetera, a monsoon comes through, everybody bows down. You don't fight with the monsoon. You better have sails that will stand the monsoon. If you do have sails that will stand the monsoon, you're going to go like a jackrabbit, right? You'll be just fine, provided you know where you're going. Whoops. Then there's the whole intricate coastal geography of the Mediterranean. So the seasonal wind regime of the Mediterranean, just to get back on target here, is one in which basically there are two different ways in ancient times you could move around. One of them is in a galley that is rowed, usually that's a very expensive proposition, and usually you'd rather have slaves do the rowing, thank you. And if they were captives of war, all the better, right? And so that system is put into effect by the Romans, and it continues on through. There are galleys in the Battle of Lepanto, which is in 1571. I'm making up a number, but I think that's close to right, in which the Habsburg Navy and the Ottoman Navy come at one another, and the Ottomans lose. But the next year they rebuilt their entire fleet and they're back in action. And did they actually lose? Who gets to say in that kind of way of doing the chronologies? All right, so the intricate coastal geography. Can I back up? Well, wait, I don't have a Mediterranean one there. Hang on. Well, let's just look at this Mediterranean one for now. So screw your eyes down to looking at the Mediterranean. This is all the inland little seas. So the Adriatic, the Tyrrhenian, the different other things. Who gets? It's the game that we play with. Who gets to have a continent, right? We can play with who gets to have a sea in the Mediterranean. Is this space actually a sea, or is it some other body of water we're not going to call a sea, because sea means it's sort of something, whereas if it's not, it's not. So the Black Sea, the Red Sea, the Persian Gulf, all of these are sort of within range, and then there are all the rivers, some of which are navigable, others of which are not navigable, or navigable with difficulty after you get over the hump. If you go up the Black Sea, whoops, what just happened there? Let's do that. So you go up the Black Sea, as you can see, you can go across to the Caspian, which is the very white one. I don't know why it came out so bright there, but if we're moving more or less to the center, just north of the Persian Gulf, there's this big white, vivid white spot. That's the Caspian Sea, and there's major Russian river systems that come down. So you can go from the Aral Sea, which is not there, which is the tiny little one above Crimea, to the right. You can go from that via water systems to the Caspian, and from the Caspian, then you're on the steppe, or you're in Persia, right? So it's so you can get a lot of places in a boat from the Mediterranean, and they don't all have the same wind regimes either, right? So but mostly, if it's in the Mediterranean, I don't know about the Caspian. That's why I said that. But which alas these days, anybody see any picture of the Caspian recently? Right. NOH2O.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, it's just like, oh, truly extraordinary. So anyway, all right. So back in action. Okay. So let's go to the Indian Ocean. So that is a different wind regime. So I've already tipped my hand. That is here we are in monsoon land. That's seasonal. So it comes to India in sort of November-ish. I've been there in that period. And then there's another one in the spring going the other way. The sail regime here is triangular. The dhow is the DHOW is the sail, is the boat of preference. Dhows come in various sizes. Here is just one. It's not as big as they get. They get quite a bit bigger than that. In this world, in this toolkit, there is something called the portolan, and that's some sort of bastardized Latin, I think. And what it is it's kind of interesting. So here you are, let's just roll the cameras back and we're in a boat and we're sailing along the coast of California. What would a portalon of the coast of California look like? Well, it would be, okay, so you know you're getting near Monterey when you can see, oh God, they didn't build the Catholic Church yet.
No.
Oh. Well, when you can see something, right? See these hills, right? There's a particular formation of these hills. You line yourself up with the high point of that. You sail right in. There you are, Monterey Harbor. Whoops, we forgot to build the harbor, but there it is. Right. So then you carry around Monterey Bay. Let's just drop it down to the scale of Monterey Bay. And then, so different features that you can see from the water then become key to map your movements by. And you move along and your gaze at those things is going to shift. So in some cases you can see the church, in some cases you can, or you can see the really tall cypress tree that's on the top of that hill, or some other way of navigating yourself. A mountain behind it lines up with some hills in front of it in a certain way, different other ways of talking about that. So in the case of the Mediterranean, the portalon also comes into existence. And it's basically a way of aiding the memory of the navigator on board, right? And so it's okay, so we haven't been in this part of the Mediterranean before. We're supposed to be coming near Marseille. What would it look like? Let's get out the portalon and have a look. And so it gives you some features to look for, some islands and the disposition of those islands vis-a-vis what becomes the harbor, et cetera, et cetera. And at that point, you begin to go, okay, now we know how to do this, right? The portalon is also called a rudder. And I'm not sure what language that comes out of, but maybe somebody could enlighten us. And then another instrument is the astrolabe, which is something that is developed in the Indian Ocean World navigational toolkit, right? So the portalon, the rudder, the triangular sails, all of these become important. The rudder is a common feature. Astrolabes are invented first in the lands of Islam and then diffused elsewhere. They become, that is to say, part of the navigation toolkit. Triangular sails are useful in the Mediterranean, not so useful in the Mediterranean, where square sails are better because you want the wind behind you. You want these big boats to just sort of catch the wind and go, whoa, right? But the winds in the Mediterranean are very fickle and they change seasonally. And so certain seasons you're just fine. Other seasons you go, where did those oarsmen go, right? Because suddenly you're becalmed, right? And so you need plan 2 to be able to get anywhere, or else you just sort of creep and creep and creep, drifting and drifting. All right, so the wind regime of the Mediterranean is different from the Red Sea, sort of the bit of the Indian Ocean that comes up towards the southern part of Arabia, etc. And that is much more adapted to that. So the triangular sails versus the square sails is one dynamic. And then so astrolabe's not so useful in the Mediterranean. We know our Mediterranean, we know where we're going. Whereas parts of the Indian Ocean, when you're going, where did our astrolabe go? We really need to be able to figure out exactly where we are. So an astrolabe allows you to, we have a compass, we got that from the Chinese, but we don't still quite have the whole navigational toolkit in terms of the sort of the devices that we need. So the astrolabe is a kind of a fill-in at this point.
Does it deal with the stars, the astrolabe?
Sorry.
Does the astrolabe deal with
Stars, yeah.
stars?
Yeah, stars, yeah.
The portalon is a book?
And a portalon is a kind of a book, yeah, it comes out as a book. So a series of sheets that have been sort of then put together in sequence as they would appear as you're moving along. Right, so it would be having, I don't know what, interesting, Google Maps saying, or maybe back in the day, right? Well, when you see the McDonald's, turn left. Right, then you'll get down on, you'll see when you get down there a ways, then you're going to look for the boardwalk, right? Okay, so here's an astrolabe on the right and an early compass on the left. And then I have some more for you. Here's a portalon. That one, if you're sitting in the back, I'm not sure you can see it, but it is an attempt to make visible, kind of on a flat space, the whole Indian Ocean world. the lines that go between are lines that line you up with different stars and help you to navigate along the path. So at some point, we also get a sense that we need to have maps. So the Portolan is not a map, it's directions. It's sort of visual directions. And so then we have maps, and Al-Idrisi is somebody, is a Muslim in the employ of the Ottoman government. So the early Ottoman government, 1453 starts the Ottoman Empire. Some people push it back further because that's actually when they conquered Istanbul, that is to say Constantinople. How is this a map? Well, you have to look sort of sideways at it. Maybe I'll flip back to that when we have our break and people can come up and look at it, but it's quite fascinating to have a peek at. Okay, we're moving along. I'd like to get through this next. Here's a whole different approach to shipping, right? So this is what the Atlantic shipping toolkit gets to have later in the game. This is not anything like what Columbus and company are moving with. So cross staff and sectant sort of surpasses the cross staff. Which is also called the Jack staff, I think, which is a rather funny name, but anyway, Jack no doubt had a patent on it. Here we are. So we're back to our navigation situation, right? And I think this is a good place to stop, and let's have our break, and then let me flip back to the Idrisi map. There we are, and put the lights on, and we're good. So if we have questions, by the way, this is a good time, and I have to do the thing I told myself I needed to do, and then I didn't. So when I taught world history at UCSC, I could not teach beginners. Mostly world history is wasted on freshmen, in my opinion. World history has to be taught to people actually know some history. So by the time I got them, they would have been through 4 or 5 national histories, and sometimes 2 course sequences of Chinese history, European history, Indian history, Islamic history, etc. And they would come with having traveled in one thing and another. And I would say to them, as I'm saying to you now, in this room, we are all world historians. World history is not a job for experts. World history is a job for people who are trying to make sense of the larger environment and its deeper past that surrounds that. Everybody has relevant experiences traveling, either traveling mentally, as you can do on the internet or on TV or in the movie theater, or traveling and actual traveling. In terms of education, the different things that you learn may or may not seem relevant to history to you. Part of what the Toolkits thing is to sort of make a lot more things relevant for history than normally would be the case. And so as we move along together, I'm hoping I'm going to be doing this again in the fall. So I started with wanting to have 4 weeks, and then somehow I lost out on the elbowing, and I didn't understand what was going on, and we ended up with 3. That's fine. I'm not complaining, but it is a situation where I have more to say for sure, and I would very much like to say it, and we'll do it as we go forward. So, but the toolkit thing then is a way of starting in a different angle. So you don't start with experts, you don't start with advanced scientists. You start with people who are solving specific problems of navigation, specific problems of how you get the water from here to there without all of it running out the end of the hose in the middle. So the toolkits are assembled partly by experts, to be sure, and sometimes experts who are lavishly paid for the purpose by some court, and sometimes they are things that just sort of come together magically as solution to particular local and regional ecological environmental problems, right? Different wind regimes, different toolkits, right? And that's sort of the way it works out. All right, so now let's have the break, and you are all hereby. So this is for the Zoomers. So I'm being asked a question about the Indian Ocean Portolan that we had on display a bit earlier before our break. And the question is, well, so what's the data that went into the making of this rather accurate seeming map, right? And its various star directions and so on that are also inscribed into it. And the answer is, I don't know. So the observation is that
you look at the map that you gave us of Eurasia,
Right.
it's a pretty good guide to Chinese intervention, control, purchasing of land, distribution of goods today.
Minus the porcelain and the silks. Okay, so last time when I was up here, I noticed that my voice was no longer quite what it had started out as. So I don't know how it's doing for you guys, but particularly I think for the Zoomers, it might be appreciated if I fire this thing up. So let's see how this goes. Hello, hello. Okay, there we go. Okay, so let's ditch out of this. Okay, so this is a map of the Indian Ocean world, complete with China, and it has various data points on it. It shows you the white arrows are showing you what happens in the monsoon, whether the winds go up or the winds go down, and then they go looking across India. And they definitely show some of those places in East Africa that some people were curious about during the break. So this is so the interconnectedness of the Indian Ocean world, we call it in a sort of a big way, which extends on over to the Chinese bit, from the more Islamic bit, which is the sort of west of India, and then the sort of the Bay of Bengal, which is sort of in the middle, where everybody gets together, right? So these are this is the other bigger Mediterranean, right? So the Mediterranean is something, but this is much bigger, much more important by the time as we're creeping forward into the 15th century and to the finish line in 1500. This has become a very dynamic, interactive, commercial, political, and other zone, right? And so Chinese products, textiles and porcelain are just one small thing. This is, of course, by the 15th century, we were getting into the spice trade, which starts out with being the pepper trade, and then cycles through a bunch of other products as well, mostly natural products, so coffee, tea, other things come through, and then nutmeg, various other amazing products that come from down under that end up in your kitchen, right? Sitting in your kitchen cabinet. Cottons are being produced in India. Cottons are being manufactured and sold to high quality from India into East Africa. That's a natural sort of place for them to be selling their cotton goods. Indian cottons are much in demand at the elite level in the lands of Islam and in the Mediterranean world as well. And both cottons and silks, of course, will change and sugar indeed, which all are leading commercial crops thereafter, will once the world is put together, so to speak, which happens around 1500 with the various Iberian voyages, then we're in a whole different universe. One thing I wanted to do, if I have enough light to be able to do it, which I don't quite think I do, alas.
David, yeah.
So I just, there's this quote of Captain Cook about Polynesian navigators that I wanted to read because it provides a kind of a baseline for a lot of thinking about the world of this era. All right, so this is in February of 1778, the famous Captain Cook gave some impressions to somebody on his ship about Polynesian navigators, to whom he had one on board, whom he totally ignored. Right, and so, but then he's realized, whoops, maybe that wasn't so smart. So he says, how shall we account for this nation's having spread itself? He's talking about the Polynesian peoples in so many detached islands, so widely disjoined from each other in every quarter of the Pacific Ocean. We find it from New Zealand in the south, as far as the Sandwich Islands, aka Hawaii, right? Maybe that's where, yeah, let's leave Hawaiian sandwiches out of this. To the north, and in another direction from Easter Island to the Hebrides, Vanuatu, right? That is over an extent of 60 degrees of latitude or 1,200 leagues north and south, and 83 degrees of longitude, or 1,660 leagues east and west. How much farther in either direction its colonies reach is not known at that point. But what we know already, in consequence of this and our former voyages, so the second voyage, warrants are pronouncing it to be, though perhaps not the most numerous, certainly by far the most extensive nation upon the earth.
Even though we ignored them.
So we could lower the flame again. Thank you. Delight. But so this is just to get a sense that, okay, Captain Cook does not say things idly, right? He wants to make sure his biographer is hanging around at every moment. So he did nonetheless feel called upon to pronounce on this subject. So that I thought that was worth reading. Okay, so onward. All right, so here, this is a caravel. So this is the kind of boat that the Portuguese used to navigate along the West African coast, right? So we've now transited into another story that I'm going to tiptoe lightly through, actually, because I don't want to dwell on it at great length. But it is a sign that the triangular sail has now moved into the Atlantic, right? Which is not its natural home, and Columbus does not have a boat that consists entirely of triangular sails. He's got a mix. But they use this to explore coastal Africa, which they do point to point. So again, I think I neglected to really reinforce this point a little bit earlier on before the break, and to say that that point-to-point navigation was really basically what we did, we humans, before we learned about longitude and latitude, and before we got compasses and other more complicated instruments to help us know where the heck we were. All right, so the Portuguese get all the way down to the tip of Africa, which takes them fully a century to accomplish. So there's a problem here if you're a sailor. What's our problem?
Water.
Besides water? No, there's a toolkit problem.
Vitamin C.
Not even.
Wind direction.
Wind direction. Has anybody ever tried to sail from Santa Cruz to San Francisco? How many days would it take you? The wind comes the other way, right? So you have to have a motorized vehicle or a very big piece of patience in order to do that. No mobile hand gadgets allowed, right? Back in the day when people were sailors, this is the way you worked, right? And it took you forever to get lots of places. So if you're going down West Africa, the wind's behind you. Smiles on your face. There we are. Oh, what is this lovely land we're coming to, right? But try going the other way. And then the water problem kicks in as well. So you can get down to Cape Town, right? You can get down to there, which
I think we should go though.
David, give me my date.
Just leave it on.
I don't know. Anyway, so the end of the 15th
Don't
century.
you want to be down there at
Right,
12:30?
and so, but you can't come back up. And so the Portuguese, so what the Portuguese discover, and this is not about their navigational ability. It's about
He's so sweet.
well, okay, if you're a sailor, you're a sailor. You got to do
Maybe I
what
might crawl into this.
they get out and they get hit by a bunch of wind that takes them off to the coast of Brazil, and they're this is, and then they go, okay, and then they hit trade winds, and the trade winds take them up and over, right, so they can get back. They didn't set out to discover that this was the magic passageway, and they certainly didn't want to tell their rivals, the Spanish, that this particular little motorized vehicle existed. But nonetheless, that is how they managed to do it. So if you were going to India, that was great, bring your trade goods, trade with the locals. Now try getting home. Are you in the maritime insurance business? Would you put money into one of these vessels, right? How much chance is it that it's going to actually come back alive, right? And bring its goods and so on. Well, it didn't matter in the end. If you had 5 ships loaded with pepper and only 3 came back, you're going to be very rich, right? Because it just commanded top prices at that time. Yeah.
So then Burke had the way their navigational line were going, they were following the current. which is the wind.
Well, no, but not necessarily. So the Gulf Stream, for example, goes in circles. The Japan current goes in circles too. So the Japan current will take you down. Once you figure that out, then you can come down the coast, that and the winds behind you. But if you're trying to go to the Philippines, because there were something called the Manila galleons, soon after Magellan went around the world, he went around the world backwards, so to speak, around South America, I'm sorry, and then off into the void and landed in the Philippines. And he didn't know where he was going to land. And unfortunately, he landed in a bad patch and he took the wrong side of the quarrel. And he didn't make it back alive. So it's actually the Magellan-Del Cano voyages, because Del Cano was his second in command and he got the boats, or many of the boats, back around. All right, so let's just get into that story. All right, so the famous trio, Columbus, Vasco da Gama, and Magellan del Cano, that's actually four, are the ones who create the world that we live in now. They allow the toolkit to be widely disseminated. They allow the navigational toolkit to become king in a way in which even in the Indian Ocean world it hadn't quite, although the Indian Ocean world had been knit together as a result of it, to be sure. So what's in that toolkit includes the stern post rudder, China, check, portalon, router, okay, Mediterranean, compass, Chinese, cross staff, European, Mediterranean, astrolabe, Islamic, and whoops, they also have cannon. All right, so that is another story that is going on. So the annoying problem with talking about toolkits is all well and good, but then some stories start intersecting with other stories. So there is a toolkit for the development and dissemination of firearms and gunpowder-driven weapons. We haven't hit it yet. So anyway, this is the terms of trade that the Portuguese encounter when they get to Calicut Harbor, where they steam in 1498 under Vasco da Gama, having supposedly taken an Indian navigator, now is the thought, on board. It used to be thought that actually it was a famous Islamic navigator, Arab navigator, but that guy was long since retired. He was still alive, but he was long since retired. It was not that person. So when the Portuguese came to trade, they showed their trade goods, and they were pronounced by the Hindu chief who was ruling that particular city at that time being totally inferior. Why would anybody want these trade goods? Just get this lot out of here. They're hopeless, right? Well, the city of Calicut was at that point co-inhabited by not only Hindus but also by Muslims. And Vasco, poor dear, thought that actually these people, the Hindus, that is to say, were practicing a form of Christianity a little bit strange to him, not in Latin. He couldn't quite follow the mass, but he could sort of see that it sort of looked like it was sort of a variant of Christianity. Alas, he's not the only one that was geographically challenged. Columbus, to the end of his day, thought that he had landed in Japan. So it's play with that for a little bit too. Anyway, so the use of cannon became very useful. Cannon became very useful in trading relationships. So you just pull alongside a boat, you say, okay, hand it over, right? If you don't hand it over, bad things will happen. Maybe bad things will happen anyway. If you're Muslim, they very well might. Because the Portuguese are not only exporting their prowess in the high seas, they are also simultaneously exporting the Reconquista, which is a particular ideology that drove Iberians in this period, right? So I think we may have come to the end. Oh, except for that. All right. So this is the map of these Iberian voyages, and you can see that the whole world is encompassed, and it's quite remarkable. And it's in a century or so of time, a little bit less, the whole thing is put together. And the Chinese have been happily using the Philippines as a base station for their trade on the spice trade and various other trade goods they were interested in. including sea cucumbers, which were known to be aphrodisiac and therefore had a high price. Those were found in Australia, right off the Australian coast, in the north. All right, this is it's a truly remarkable map, and it does transform the world, and it connects the world in a way in which it had never been connected, because now the Americas are part of it, and the Americas are part of it, unfortunately, in a way that catches them completely by surprise, because it also has to. They are not part of the disease regimes that exist in the connected parts of the world. And therefore, the Valley of Mexico, which had a population of something like 20 million, when Cortez first gets there, a century later has a population of 1.5 million. Right. And so, and some of that has to do with the Reconquista savagery of the Spanish, to be sure, as well. Right. They're not friendly at all when they first show up. There is a lot of debate going on right now using DNA and other tools that were not known to archaeologists who gave that 20 to 1 sobering number. And that is very much under cross questioning at the moment. So it's whether it was 20 to 1 or it was 10 to 1, it's still pretty ghastly. Right? What was the population of Hispaniola when Columbus first wandered into it? Was it 1 million, as some say? What was the population of Puerto Rico, which may have been 2 million, some say? Well, others now following the DNA are saying way less than that. Right? So we actually don't know. The game is still very much in play. But that the Caribbean was also a Mediterranean is a thought that we should carry away from this lecture. Thank you. Okay, so questions.
Your comment about Regama, I'm aware that along the west coast of India, there is a belief that Thomas the Apostle got there and that Christianity was actually established in India in the 1st century CE.
Right.
So just that could explain, he may have been dealing with people who were actually Christian descendants.
Right. So there is a question this is for the benefit of the people who are Zooming, about whether Thomas the Apostle did get to East Africa or not.
Not East Africa, West India.
Oh, West India. Yeah, sorry. So that is indeed a belief that is held. And I think the game is still in play, and we can choose up our sides and have a merry time. But certainly there were Christians in India that had been there for hundreds of years when modernish Europeans first showed up. So the kind of modern European that would mistake a Hindu for a Christian, for example.
But that's what I'm saying. He may not have been going to Hindu services. He may have been going to Christian services.
No. We know quite a bit about that, and no,
Really? Right.
yeah, no, that's not true. But so that there were Christians and Jews, of course, in India is absolutely true. I have a picture I took, which I'll see if I can sneak it in somewhere else. I was in, where was I? I did this. I think I was in Calicut, actually, which now has an impossibly difficult name to pronounce because the Indian government has gone around rebaptizing all these names. So if you go as a tourist to a place which has one name, now you come back and you say, sorry, where are you? Are you in Kotakose? So it becomes quite funny. Well, this is just my personal prejudice, but I think if you're not willing to have your name translated, your actual name be used to seat your state in the UN, then you should not be allowed to force people to say the names of your cities that you have rebaptized. When you get on a plane and you go to Florence, you get off the plane and you're in Firenze. Sorry, it's the way it goes, right? That's part of the marvel of traveling. So if you are in the UN and they call the delegate for Bharat to stand up, then the Indian delegate can indeed stand up, right? But until we do that, I think we can call things what we want to. This is a fascistic government that has imposed these names. Sorry. Anyway, back in the day, we were having a conversation here, and before I stepped on it. So, yeah.
Population figure of 20 million, what area did that?
Just the Valley of Mexico.
Mexico.
That's what I was told. Yes, by an expert and friend. So, and I even read it in books. So it must be good. So so the interesting thing, when you start doing this kind of world history and you start blundering into archaeologists and others that you wouldn't ordinarily read, and also just so much time has gone on, so that things that look like they were nailed down are now maybe only sewn down. And the threat has frayed a bit. The history is a game that, you know, continues to be in play at all times, and we continue to revise our opinions, or right or wrong, inspired by various strange notions as well as perhaps by evidence. And some days a strange notion is also later gets to count as evidence. Oh dear. Okay, so question.
Well, this toolkit perspective I find really interesting. I wish history had been taught this way, say, in high school.
Mhm.
My question is the history curriculum adopting this approach?
No, well, no, not really, although there are little signs on the horizon, let us say. So that so I'm in touch with a colleague who does teacher education in the East Coast, and she is working with a group of secondary school teachers and has been for 20 or more years, and they are doing world history trainings. And she passed them the essay. So you didn't all get the essay that launched me, which is this 2009 Journal of World History thing. I think it went out with the OLLI paraphernalia. But if you didn't get it, send me an email, and I will send you a PDF in return. Anyway, it's a 2009 Journal of World History essay called "Islam at the Center: Technological Complexes in World History." I think it's a somewhat pompous title. Yes, hello.
The data for sizing these vessels from China, was that, you know, descriptions of contemporaries or based on any archaeological evidence?
So we do have different contemporaries of the time who observed these vessels, and we also have Ibn Battuta and Marco Polo together talking about the very large size of Chinese ships. So we do know that much is for sure. For sure, Chinese archaeologists have not been able to replicate this. So they have been digging around in the mud here and there, finding relics of all Chinese ships, but nothing on this scale at all, right? So, and to do this, again, they would have had to just drain entire provinces of their best wood in order to construct them, right? And have the wastage of wood involved. It does not bear thought unless you like to, you know, look at a massacre scene. Yeah.
I couldn't find your email address.
Oh, okay. So let me say that, and I'm going to correct that next time. I didn't actually have that thought, and then I intended to put it on a slide, and then I didn't. So, and I'm also waiting for questions from the Zoom people if they have any. So I will say that in this microphone, so maybe they could hear. So anyway, my email address is eburke, all lowercase, EBURKE, at ucsc.edu. So eburke@ucsc.edu.
So Carrie, it seems surprising that the Chinese never really seem to be a big maritime nation. Is that a correct statement? And if it is, why?
All right. So the question? So for the Zoom people, especially to hear, is so we don't these days have a sense of the Chinese people as a great maritime nation. Is that true, and why? And the answer is that the state is an inward-looking state. It's really involved in keeping the rice and silk flowing around in the Grand Canal and their various offshoots in the various other river systems. And yet there are all these cities on the coast who may or may not necessarily want to be marching in tune to that same message, and who are themselves interested in trading and finding out ways in which they can make their own life. So one of the interesting things I know is in the Historian of Islam, the basic Islamic Civ, also at UCSC, is that the evidence for the coming of Muslims to Indonesia, it happens more or less in the same time window that Islam comes to Indonesia, which is today the largest Muslim country in the world. Hello, it's not in the Middle East. No, you go through the top 10, and you only get to an Arab country when you get to number 10. Right. So anyway, thinking about What's the track?
China is China and maritime. Why is, how much is China?
All right, so Chinese maritime, this and that, right, all right, so Chinese Muslims and Middle Eastern Muslims together in the same time window bring Islam to Indonesia. So Indonesia is exactly, I think it's even Java is this particular place that it comes in this particular formulation. Indonesia is, as those of you who have traveled around in the southern seas a bit understand, is vast beyond belief. It's like 1,200 or 1,400 miles across. And so it's not one place. It's very much a whole lot of intricate little places, some of which are bigger than others, some of which think they're bigger than others. So that is a sign, I would take it, that this 1,400 to 1,500 sort of grades growth of the southern Mediterranean into a really bustling market is correct, right? So that there's not just the spice trade, it's also trade for Chinese goods, it's also trade for Indian cottons, it's also trade for Middle Eastern products, which move back and forth and into the Mediterranean. So the Venetians, the Genoese, both are very hot to get into these markets so that they have things that they can put a high cost value on when they sell them back to the great houses in Europe. So this is a really big deal in that time period, and it's a sign that there is getting to be a world economy minus Europe before Europe crosses the threshold. So that's the other thing to take home. So it's not just because Europe comes that somehow things turn out the way they do, but actually you could think, well, what if Vasco da Gama and his guys didn't figure out a way to get back from Southern Africa, right? Mr. Del Cano is out of business, right? Maybe he can get to the Philippines, but can he get all the way home? So that is the sort of a question. What if the Chinese, instead of having Mongols to face, decided that they were going to put their energy into their outboard empire, and at which point they might encounter Portuguese, and they invented gunpowder weapons before the Portuguese did. So what would have happened, right? So had Zheng He wanted to go around, could he have done it? Well, we already answered that question. The Portuguese couldn't either, right? So no, he couldn't sail up the west coast of Africa because nobody can. Right? Yes, he has more water, but you're still in the middle of the Atlantic. So unless you hit those winds at the right time, hit the currents that are going to swing you around and bring you up to Europe, you're not going to necessarily go there. And nobody has mapped those that has been made to tell the tale. Maybe somebody did, in other words, but we just don't know. Nancy?
What were the products that the Indians turned down that the Portuguese brought to trade?
Some kind of wretched, I forget what it all was now, but it wouldn't rise above the threshold. If you found it in your vacation cabin, and you would go, who put all this stuff here, right?
Could it be wool? Which they should.
Not even wool, no. I mean, but of course, that was a product that was very big on the market in Northern Europe,
Right.
but very inappropriate for India. Sorry. Well, oh, it's so scratchy. Anybody else could? So let me say a little bit about where we're going to go from here. Well, actually, let me just say some things about where we might go from here. If I don't actually know what I'm going to do in the next lecture. I have some thoughts. So one of them is, well, okay, just to get everything back up to snuff. I was thinking that it might be nice to go to the gunpowder revolution. Now we would get it also put together with the geopolitics and then nailed back in again. And if that pleases you, we'll do that. However, I did have this in the same way of trying to start with thinking about Oceania as our center of maritime navigation. I had this thought of talking about no, it is earth, not water, and to talk about the domestication of animals and warfare technology. So that is to say, here we go again, putting together a Stone Age toolkit that later becomes a early Empire toolkit back in the Holocene and then transits on through. All right, so what would that have looked like? Well, actually, I think I'll just do a little riff on that right now, let's get it out of the way. So let's just think that we're trying to now imagine a world in which Earth is indeed the name of this planet that we inhabit. And the sign of that would be the ability to move around on it, right? And that would mean domestication of animals and the development of various equipment that would go with that, and of abilities to work with the animals and find out the things they can do and they can't do. Yes, it's true, we can domesticate giraffes, but then you have to start all over again with the kids. Right, so you have to domesticate, you have to continue to domesticate your giraffes, not giraffes, I said it wrong. It's zebras. Zebras is the one they've done the experiment with. So yes, you could then domesticate zebras, but that's not going to get us there. So, all right, so you have about 2000 BC or so, people who are known as the Scythians, some might know them as the Scythians, depending on how they were brought up. And they thrive in the area above the Caspian Sea. They are known to Herodotus, although he made a lot of stuff up. And they are definitely known to the Persian empires and the Babylonian empires that preceded them. And so these are people who have mastered the use of horses, wherewith you can find the evidence, because when the chiefs die, the horses are slaughtered and put in the same grave. Such are they venerated, right? So it's a little creepy, but it also is a sign of things. Right? They had a technology, so the technology for writing goes back to about 2000 BC, just to use those terms, and then it gradually gets improved as time goes on. Eventually, saddles are invented, bridles, all the other things that go with. Who's the horseback rider here? Are there any horseback riders in the room? Oh dear. See, now this is a link to another era as well.
I was when I was much younger.
Yeah, well, that's it. That's fine. Yeah, I had my picture taken on a horse, but that doesn't count. I was 2 years old at the time. So anyway, the saddles and bridles and so on get more and more developed and elaborated. Technology of working with horses, making them do different things on command, finding ways of really getting close to your animals such that you become one with them. That's the experience I've heard people tell me that are riders, right? And it's extraordinary, and it just sounds like it's transporting, literally as well as figuratively. And and then there's the domestication of the camel, development of saddles for camels, et cetera, different kinds of camels, one hump, two hump, oh dear, where are we? And all of those kinds of things, right? So people get better and better at organizing and utilizing cattle and donkeys as well as horses and camels, and it stays within more or less the same toolkit box, right? And so endless little fidgets with different things that you can do in different cultures, and some of them might be good for a toolkit that could, so it would spread around and everybody would do it. Others, I mean, I have a friend of mine who is a specialist on the steppe peoples of inner Eurasia, and there's an historical big thing that happens longer about, I don't know what, 1400 or so. It's sort of just post-Mongol. Mongols are not quite up on this, and it has to do with how you ride your horse to battle. Do you ride your horse to battle like the Sioux Indians, such that you're firing from under the front of your horse as you're galloping at a fast pace? Or do you go the other way and you barricade up your horse with all kinds of armor on it and on the rider, and you do it in a whole different approach, right? And the Turkic peoples in Inter-Eurasia come to opposite conclusions on how to go about doing that, right? So you can have these kinds of family lineages of how we take horses to battle. All right, so here's where I want to end, because we're getting towards an end, and I do know that there are questions, and I'd be quite happy to entertain them as well. And some of you may know this movie that I think I remember seeing in the Nickelodeon theater back in the day when I was working here, and I can't remember the title of it, but it's about a young British farm boy who is drafted and who takes his horse to battle in World War I.
Yeah. War horse.
War Horse is the film. My takeaway from that is how many horses died in World War
Oh, you know, you,
4 million is our guess,
Oh, wow.
right? That's how we know World War I was not a modern war. Right, that is a world historical cutting edge, right? That after that, it's different. Then we have Patton, then we have Rommel, then we have.
you still have in World War II, you still have millions of horses killed in the Russian and Eastern Front.
Oh,
Germany,
I stand-
you still use horses.
I stand corrected. Okay, so that's an important footnote. That definitely, yeah.
Yeah, a horse question. Is it correct there were no horses in the Americas before this Columbus and the Spanish?
So the question is, what happened to the horses in the America that are attested by the archaeological records? There were
That's
horses.
what I'm asking. I just.
And the answer is the locals ate them.
Wow.
Well, that's a little savage, but I did get your attention. However, we are getting too much time, yes. But this is not France, so you can't have cheval, I'm sorry.
I'm just wondering if the indigenous Americans in North America ever rode horses before the Europeans.
My information on that is no, right? That is a reinvention, right? That comes later after horses are released when they are brought by the Spanish, Portuguese, and others. And so there were horses, and there are major sort of transformations in the world economy. There are predators that don't exist in other places. There's a number of other justifications for why there no longer are horses. Right? But that's because the horses actually migrated out of Asia here, and then they migrated back again to some degree.
Well, the
So there's-
native people, I mean, the native people to the Americas, they rode horses.
Only after. What I'm saying is that's only after the Europeans come here.
Oh, yeah, okay, well, I didn't realize.
So I mean, so if somebody wants to do some research on that, I'm open to being corrected on this, but.
No, I'm sure that
Yeah,
you're right.
no, that would be interesting to know. It's a very interesting question.
All those movies,
Right.
and they're always showing them.
All right, so here's another one. This is an arcania of environmental history. So it is alleged by some sources there were no earthworms in the Americas because they stood 10 feet high. Right, so somebody wants to go do some research on that. That would be interesting too. So now you have your homework. I think we'll say goodbye.